Emma and Thomas Bradford looked like the perfect couple. She was the warm-hearted baker everyone loved, and he was the quiet, dependable teacher. But behind their charming front porch and polite smiles, Emma was hiding a dark secret. And when her affair with an old flame threatened to shatter the life she built, she made a chilling decision. To poison her husband slowly, silently, and without a trace. What followed was a deadly game of lies, calculated moves, and a murder masked as heartbreak. Emma Bradford had built a life that most people in her small Vermont town envied. Her house sat at the end of a tree-lined street, with a wraparound porch that always had a fresh pot of flowers no matter the season. Her husband, Thomas Bradford, was a respected high school chemistry teacher, known for being patient, soft-spoken, and a little old-fashioned. Emma herself ran a home-based bakery that had become wildly popular, with people ordering her cinnamon rolls and cherry pies weeks in advance. To anyone on the outside looking in, the Bradfords were the embodiment of a stable, loving couple living a quiet, fulfilling life. They had been married for 11 years. Every holiday was documented on social media, every anniversary marked with a heartfelt post and a smiling photo. Their Labrador, Daisy, appeared in almost every picture, her golden coat glistening in the sunlight as she lounged by the couple's feet. Their kitchen, where Emma spent most of her days baking, looked like it came straight out of a country home magazine. Polished countertops, vintage mason jars filled with flour and sugar, a chalkboard with inspirational quotes written in cursive. Everything seemed picturesque. Everything seemed perfect. But appearances can be deceiving. As the years passed, there were signs that something wasn't right behind the walls of that cheerful house. Neighbors sometimes heard raised voices at night, quickly followed by silence. Thomas began to look increasingly tired. He would come home from school, eat dinner quietly, and head straight to bed, his energy drained, his eyes dull. At first, Emma explained it away. He was overworked, she told friends. The school district was understaffed, and he had taken on extra classes. Some people believed her. Others weren't so sure. Emma, meanwhile, remained her bubbly, cheerful self, always smiling at the farmer's market, always offering baked goods to neighbors. But there was a subtle shift in how she presented herself. She began dressing differently, more carefully put together, her makeup a little more noticeable, her perfume a little stronger. She went for late-night walks more often, usually saying she just needed to clear her head. When asked where Thomas was, she'd wave it off. "He's asleep already. Poor thing's exhausted." The truth was, Emma had grown restless, bored. Somewhere along the way, the spark had died, and she no longer saw Thomas as her partner, but more like a fixture in her life. She still played the part, posting loving captions, celebrating milestones, but her heart had moved elsewhere. That elsewhere was Ryan Claymore. Ryan had once been her college boyfriend, the one that got away. They reconnected by chance through a Facebook group for alumni. At first, it was innocent enough. A few comments on each other's photos, a private message or two. But soon the messages became more frequent. Then they became flirtatious, then explicit. Within weeks, they were speaking daily. Ryan wasn't married, didn't have kids, and owned his own landscaping business. He made her feel young again, seen, desired. He called her beautiful, told her she deserved more. And Emma believed him. What began online quickly turned physical. Emma would tell Thomas she had to make deliveries for her bakery in nearby towns. She'd pack her car with just enough product to sell the story. Then she'd spend the afternoon or evening with Ryan, who lived about 40 minutes away. She told him Thomas was controlling, that he barely spoke to her anymore, that he wouldn't agree to a divorce, and that leaving him would ruin her reputation, her business, maybe even her future. In truth, Thomas wasn't abusive. He was just tired, distant and unaware of the full extent of what Emma was doing behind his back. He still paid the bills, still cleaned up after dinner, still asked about her day, even if she rarely gave a real answer. He was fading, but not in the way anyone could have predicted. By the summer of their 11th anniversary, Emma had stopped pretending in private. She avoided Thomas as much as possible. She made excuses to stay out late. Her phone was always on silent, always face down. And Thomas, whether he noticed or not, said nothing. If he suspected anything, he didn't show it. He went to work. He came home. He got sicker. Because what Thomas didn't know, what no one knew, was that Emma's dissatisfaction had become dangerous. And soon her fantasy life with Ryan would demand a terrible sacrifice, one that would change everything forever. Emma's connection with Ryan Claymore wasn't a harmless fling. It had become an obsession. What started as stolen conversations late at night turned into planned rendezvous and whispered promises of a future together. Emma wasn't just falling in love again. She was slipping further away from the life she had built with Thomas and deeper into a fantasy that required erasing her reality. And to her, reality was Thomas. Ryan was nothing like her husband. He was rugged, spontaneous, and charismatic. He had a way of making Emma feel like she was the center of the universe. He didn't care about her past or her responsibilities. He talked about buying land in Maine, opening a cabin rental business, and living a simpler life. Emma latched onto those ideas like lifelines. To her, they sounded like freedom. But there was a problem. Her life wasn't simple. It was complicated, rooted in a marriage that was legally and financially intertwined. Thomas still handled most of their money. The house was in both their names. The bakery's licenses and tax filings were tied to their joint finances. Emma couldn't just walk away, not without losing her home, her business, and possibly everything else she had worked for. And even if she could, she feared the backlash. People admired the Bradfords. To suddenly leave Thomas would stir up gossip and ruin the wholesome image she had carefully crafted for over a decade. At first, Emma considered divorce, but each time the idea came up, she dismissed it. A clean break would come with mess. Lawyers, paperwork, division of property. Worse, Thomas would probably fight to keep the house or force her to sell it. And if he suspected the affair, things could get even uglier. The thought of him exposing her, making her look like the villain, terrified her. She didn't want a scandal. She wanted escape. Ryan never explicitly encouraged anything dark, but he didn't stop Emma when she started suggesting it. When she hinted that life would be easier if Thomas just wasn't around anymore, Ryan didn't object. He changed the subject. When she brought it up again weeks later, he still didn't say no. That was all the permission Emma needed. Emma began researching. Not loudly, not carelessly, but in a quiet, calculated way that wouldn't raise suspicion. She knew how to clear browser histories and use incognito mode. She looked up undetectable poisons, symptoms that mimicked natural illness, and the kind of substances that might be overlooked in a standard autopsy. One word kept appearing in her search: thallium. Thallium was once used in rat poison, but had long been banned for consumer use in the U.S. because of its toxicity. Still, it was available through specialty chemical suppliers under certain loopholes, usually for laboratory testing or research. The effects of thallium poisoning were subtle and slow. Hair loss, fatigue, stomach pain, nerve damage. The symptoms often mimicked other conditions. And most importantly, it was almost tasteless, making it easy to administer without notice. Emma created a fake email address. She posed as a college student conducting a chemistry experiment. After several failed attempts, she found a supplier overseas willing to send a small vial of thallium to a local shipping locker she had rented under a different name. It took 3 weeks to arrive. During that time, she played the role of loving wife, running her bakery, making meals, and responding to sympathy from friends about how tired Thomas seemed lately. When the package arrived, she didn't hesitate. She began adding microscopic amounts to Thomas's morning tea. Not every day, just enough to weaken him gradually. At first, he complained of numbness in his fingers. Then came the nausea. He blamed it on stress and an old back injury flaring up. Emma listened, nodded, and told him to rest. Ryan remained unaware of the specifics. Emma only told him that she was handling things, that they'd be together soon. She started making plans for what life would look like after. She even browsed real estate listings near Ryan's town, imagining a new kitchen, a new business, a new name. She envisioned telling people that Thomas had died suddenly, and that she was rebuilding her life from tragedy. She would be seen as brave, strong, and resilient. The poison worked slowly, just as she had read. Thomas began to lose weight. He missed work more often. He grew confused, forgot things, struggled to stay awake. Doctors attributed it to possible nerve issues or a rare virus. No one thought to dig deeper. Emma was always present during appointments, nodding along, asking all the right questions. She played the role of the worried wife flawlessly. But the more Thomas declined, the more paranoid Emma became. Every phone call made her heart race. Every knock at the door felt like a threat. She began keeping the vial in a locked drawer behind the kitchen pantry, wrapped in layers of cloth. She feared getting caught, yet she couldn't stop. She believed the end was near. Soon, she thought, she would be free. Soon, she would be with Ryan. Soon, the perfect lie would become her perfect life. It was the first Monday in October when everything changed. The air had turned crisp and the leaves had started to fall in shades of burnt orange and deep red across the Bradford lawn. The town was easing into autumn, and Emma used the season as an excuse to stay home more, telling friends she was taking a break to work on a new pumpkin spice recipe for the bakery. In truth, she had grown tired of maintaining the facade. Thomas had become so weak that she barely needed to pretend anymore. He slept through most of the day and struggled just to climb the stairs. The man who had once corrected students, chemistry projects, and volunteered at the local library could now barely hold a pen. That morning, Emma woke up before sunrise, as she always did. She made herself a cup of coffee and moved quietly around the kitchen while Daisy, their dog, waited by the door. Everything was normal, routine, rehearsed. She walked upstairs at 7:30 a.m. to wake Thomas, planning to hand him his usual tea before he started his day. But when she opened the bedroom door, he was completely still. His skin was pale and cool to the touch. The sheets were undisturbed. There was no sign of distress, no struggle. His eyes were closed, his body peaceful. Thomas Bradford was dead. Emma stood there for a long moment, not moving, not speaking, just staring. Then, with a shaky breath and carefully calculated tremble in her voice, she picked up the phone and dialed 911. She told the dispatcher she had found her husband unresponsive. She cried, but not too much. She sounded shocked, but not hysterical. The emergency responders arrived within minutes, but it was already too late. They pronounced him dead at the scene. The paramedics noted the lack of trauma, the calm expression on Thomas's face. He looked like someone who had died in his sleep. One of them asked if he had any medical conditions. Emma nodded quickly and mentioned the recent episodes of fatigue, dizziness, and nausea. The paramedic jotted down the symptoms and offered quiet condolences. A local coroner arrived an hour later. There were no signs of foul play. Given Thomas's worsening health over the last few months and his sudden death, the cause was listed as a likely heart attack. No autopsy was requested. Emma played the grieving widow perfectly. She called Thomas's school and informed them of his passing. She posted a carefully worded tribute on social media that afternoon, filled with old photos of their vacations, anniversaries, and holidays. "He was my best friend," she wrote. "I am lost without him." The post received hundreds of likes and comments offering condolences. Friends stopped by with casseroles. Former students sent flowers. The town mourned the quiet, kind teacher who had passed away far too young. The funeral was held 3 days later. Emma wore a modest black dress and a long veil. She stood at the front of the church, thanking every guest for coming. She cried softly during the service, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. She gave a brief eulogy, speaking of Thomas's passion for science, his love of books, and his steady presence in her life. "He was my anchor," she said, her voice cracking at the right moments. "And now I feel adrift." No one suspected a thing. After the funeral, Emma returned home and began the process of moving on, or appearing to. She took down some of Thomas's things, boxed up old clothes, and made vague mentions of possibly relocating next year. She told friends she wasn't sure if she could stay in the house without him, that the memories were too heavy. In private, though, she felt a growing sense of relief. She had done it. She had pulled off the unthinkable. The death certificate arrived in the mail 2 weeks later, confirming cardiac arrest as the official cause. With that paper in hand, Emma contacted the bank to finalize access to their joint accounts. She closed out Thomas E.'s retirement savings and quietly paid off the small balance on the bakery's business loan. Life insurance had never been discussed much between them, but Thomas had a modest policy through his job. Emma filed the claim. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. She started seeing Ryan more openly, though not in town. She visited him late at night or met him at roadside motels outside the county. To the outside world, she was still grieving. To Ryan, she was finally free. They talked about taking a trip in the spring. Emma mentioned moving in together, maybe even starting a business. But what Emma didn't know was that someone else had noticed the cracks in her perfect story. A neighbor had seen her sneaking out late at night months earlier. Thomas's sister, Julia, was troubled by the speed of the funeral, and Emma's oddly composed demeanor. No one said anything yet, but seeds of doubt had been planted. And it wouldn't be long before those doubts grew into something much more dangerous. 4 months had passed since Thomas Bradford's death, and Emma's life appeared to be settling into a quiet rhythm again. She had reopened her bakery, now branding it with a fresh logo and a new line of healing comfort treats. Customers returned, offering gentle hugs and warm smiles. Many admired her strength and resilience, speaking of how inspiring she was. Emma leaned into the role, wearing her grief like a graceful accessory, just visible enough to earn sympathy but never so overwhelming that it seemed suspicious. But underneath the surface, things weren't as calm as they seemed. Thomas's sister, Julia, had never fully accepted the explanation of his death. Something about it didn't sit right with her. She kept going over their last few conversations, especially the strange fatigue he described over the phone just weeks before he died. She remembered him sounding confused, saying he had trouble holding a pen at work, and that his vision was blurring. Julia had urged him to see a specialist. He promised he would. Then, suddenly, he was gone. After the funeral, Julia had offered to help Emma sort through Thomas's belongings. Emma politely declined. She claimed she was handling things on her own, needing the space to grieve. That refusal didn't raise many eyebrows at the time, but to Julia, it felt like a door being closed a little too forcefully. So when she visited Emma one day under the pretense of dropping off a photo album, she casually asked if she could take Thomas's old laptop home to clean out files and keep any family pictures. Emma hesitated, but eventually handed it over. Back at home, Julia began sifting through the computer. Most of it was what she expected: lesson plans, spreadsheets, and folders full of school documents. But then she found a folder labeled Emma, buried under a few layers of subfolders. Inside were screenshots of messages, saved emails, and even old photos that Thomas had apparently found months earlier. Julia realized that Thomas had discovered Emma's affair before he died. The tone of the messages was shocking. The relationship between Emma and Ryan wasn't just romantic. It was intimate, obsessive, and disturbingly intense. One message stood out more than the others. Emma had asked Ryan, "Are you sure the amount is right? I don't want to make him sicker than necessary." It was vague but deeply unsettling. Julia's stomach dropped. She didn't want to believe what she was reading, but she couldn't ignore it. The words hinted at more than infidelity. They hinted at planning, at intent. It was enough for Julia to go to the police. She brought the laptop to the local precinct and shared her concerns. At first, investigators were skeptical. There had been no autopsy. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. But as they reviewed the messages and emails more closely, doubts began to emerge. The wording in some of the exchanges between Emma and Ryan was evasive, coded, almost as if they were trying not to say something out loud. Combined with Thomas's odd symptoms before death, the case began to look less like a tragedy and more like a mystery. A judge approved the exhumation of Thomas's body. Toxicology tests were conducted that had not been performed initially. The results were definitive. Traces of thallium were found in his tissue samples, an unusual and highly toxic substance rarely seen in modern poisoning cases. The amount present in his system suggested prolonged exposure, consistent with being poisoned over weeks or even months. The findings turned the case from closed to criminal in an instant. Police launched a full investigation into Emma's activities in the months before Thomas's death. Digital forensics experts combed through her emails, purchase history, and browser data. They found records of a chemical order made under a fake name and sent to a local shipping locker. Security camera footage showed Emma collecting the package. They traced her search history to numerous articles and forums discussing thallium, its symptoms, and its effects on the body. It was more than enough for a warrant. Emma was arrested at home in early February. The bakery was open, customers still browsing the shelves when 2 officers walked in and took her into custody. She didn't resist. She didn't cry. She just looked stunned, as if the script she had been following had suddenly veered off course. As news of the arrest spread, the town reacted with disbelief. People who had once praised her strength and admired her resilience were now questioning everything they thought they knew. Reporters began circling. Neighbors kept their distance. Emma's carefully constructed image crumbled under the weight of the evidence against her. But the case had one more surprise waiting. Investigators had reached out to Ryan Claymore. What he told them and what he handed over would change the trial before it even began. When investigators reached out to Ryan Claymore, they weren't sure what to expect. He hadn't been charged with anything, but his name appeared throughout the digital evidence. His involvement with Emma was undeniable, and his silence up to that point had been conspicuous. Detectives hoped he might offer some insight into her mindset, perhaps even implicate himself. What they didn't anticipate was that Ryan had already begun distancing himself from Emma, and what he had to share would alter the course of the case entirely. In the weeks following Thomas Bradford's death, Ryan had grown increasingly uneasy. At first, he believed the story Emma told him, that Thomas had died of natural causes. But after Emma moved on so quickly, after she began talking about their future with unsettling certainty, cracks began to form. She never expressed guilt. She never shed tears. Her language was cold, her planning intense. Ryan, once swept up in the thrill of their affair, began to question everything. And when Emma made a disturbing comment during a late-night phone call, joking that no one misses a ghost, he realized he might be in danger too. He began recording their phone conversations. Whether out of self-preservation or guilt, Ryan kept a digital file of their calls, along with screenshots of texts Emma had sent after Thomas died. When investigators contacted him, he handed everything over. Among the files was a particularly damning call. Emma spoke in a low, confident tone, discussing how she had to dose him slowly, and how she made sure Thomas' tea was always just sweet enough to hide the taste. She talked about how easy it was to fake concern during doctor visits and how relieved she felt when the death certificate arrived. "That paper saved me," she said in the recording. "It's like having permission to move on." Ryan's cooperation not only confirmed Emma's motive and method, it revealed her complete lack of remorse. She had calculated every step, manipulating not just her husband but everyone around her. She had even lied to Ryan, claiming the poison was his idea, suggesting he'd supported it more directly than he actually had. But the evidence showed otherwise. Ryan never encouraged the plan. He never discussed poison. He never even asked for updates. His recordings, in fact, showed repeated discomfort with the direction things were going. That distinction would prove crucial in court. The prosecution built a case that painted Emma Bradford as a woman who wanted a new life so badly, she murdered to get it. They laid out the timeline in chilling detail. Her deepening affair with Ryan, her research into poisons, the illegal purchase of thallium, and the gradual decline of her husband's health. Jurors listened to the phone recordings with visible shock. They saw the messages, the browser history, the shipping locker footage, and they watched Emma sit expressionless, offering no reaction as her private plans were laid bare. Her defense team argued that the evidence was circumstantial. They tried to claim the poison could have come from another source, that Thomas's symptoms could match other conditions. They even tried to undermine Ryan's credibility, suggesting he had manipulated Emma into taking the fall. But the recordings told a different story, one in which Emma was not a victim but the orchestrator. After a 2-week trial, the jury deliberated for less than a day. Emma was found guilty of first-degree murder and tampering with evidence. At sentencing, the judge called her actions calculated, heartless, and cloaked in deceit. She received life in prison without the possibility of parole. The town that once adored her now avoided speaking her name. Her bakery was sold to a new owner. The house, stripped of its cheerful charm, stood empty for months before being quietly purchased by a couple unfamiliar with its dark history. Julia Bradford, though devastated, found closure in knowing the truth had been uncovered. She later donated Thomas's old books to the school library, placing a quiet dedication in the front pages, in memory of a life taken too soon, but not forgotten. As for Ryan, he left the state not long after the trial. He never spoke publicly about the case again. He never contacted Emma. And Emma, once admired for her smile and her pies, became a cautionary tale. A reminder that sometimes the most ordinary lives can hide the darkest secrets. What began as an affair, hidden in whispers and locked phones, ended in a courtroom under the bright, unblinking gaze of justice. Emma had killed to protect a fantasy, but in doing so, she had destroyed everything real.